Last week, after many heartbreaking conversations with students and parents, with faculty and administrators from several campuses over the course of the past several months, and after a visit to Columbia in New York City, I argued here that anti-Semitism has been normalized in parts of the solidarity movement, and that it threatened not only our Jewish students, but also the righteous call for justice for Palestinians. And most critically, as we now stand just half a year from a presidential election, that it jeopardizes our democracy. If you weren't here last week, I hope that you'll listen to that sermon. I'm going to consider this a part 2 to what I began last week. That was a hard sermon to give, and I know for many of you it was a hard sermon to hear. The fact is, it's hard for progressive Jews to talk about anti-Semitism, and I've been trying to understand why for the past several weeks. I've come up with at least 3 important reasons. Number 1, we have deeply internalized the value of moral triage, of keeping the narrative on the most impacted people. Right now, we think, the focus should be on the 133 hostages who are unthinkably still being held captive in Gaza now for more than 200 days. I saw a t-shirt this week that says, Kulanu Chatufim, we are all hostages, and in some ways, we are all living in suspended time and space, with these captives and their families and the whole nation in deep trauma and heartache. And right now, the focus should be on the 1.1 million Gazans who are on the brink of famine, who don't even have the luxury of burying or grieving for their loved ones because they are scavenging for food for their babies. Shifting the narrative to talk about us and our fears and our anxieties feels tone deaf at best, as if our fear for our safety is somehow comparable to the acute suffering that so many people are experiencing, even right now as we speak. Number 2, we are profoundly uncomfortable aligning with many of the people who have taken up the cause of fighting anti-Semitism. The collective Jewish communal response to anti-Semitism is rooted in grief, and it is rooted in trauma. I don't think anyone can begrudge our hypersensitivity given our history, but we know that some people in our Jewish community have developed a particular lens over the last 70 years, even well before October 7th, through which the whole world is seen as eternal enemies of the Jews. This approach does not represent our reality, neither the world that we live in nor the world that we want to build. We have strived for decades to build Jewish lives in communities that are rooted in love and in hope rather than in fear and distrust. To do so, we've had to actively distance ourselves from a seemingly singular focus on identifying, mapping, tracking, and raising the alarm about Jew haters everywhere. That's also why, even when we're holding deep concern in our hearts, we find little comfort in the elected officials who have suddenly taken up the fight against anti-Semitism ostensibly on our behalf, but who reveal an astonishingly high tolerance for anti-Semitism when it emerges from, say, the mouthpiece of the former president of the United States, or fellow insurrectionists, or white Christian nationalists. Even when we ourselves are deeply worried about an increasingly hostile climate, we are highly distrustful of these elected officials and their gleeful pursuit of our university presidents. These theatrical hearings cry out to us, Darsheni, there is something deeper going on here. Do not take this at face value. And in fact, it does not take too much investigation to uncover a cynical, self-serving campaign against higher education that is being fed by these hearings and by these press conferences. We feel used because we're being used. We see that their megaphone on our safety does not make us or our children any safer, but it does jeopardize our healthy and diverse communal discourse. And we see how it is helping us barrel toward authoritarianism in this country. Number 3, we want to remain level-headed and reasonable, even in the face of real challenges. We don't want to fuel a moral panic. Moral panic. It follows this dangerous trajectory that starts with legitimate concern and quickly moves to exaggeration and distortion of a threat, and then to increased hostility toward those perceived to be fueling that threat, and then to thoughtless consensus and entrenchment in an increasingly misrepresented reality, and finally, often ends in acts of violence. According to scholars, moral panics gather converts by playing on people's worst fears. You and I don't want to gather converts to a mindset of fear and absolutism. In fact, adopting that thoughtless mindset is precisely what threatens the very foundation of the world that we have worked so hard to build over the past many decades. Critical thinking, curiosity, discernment, these are our intellectual and moral objectives. So moral triage, an aversion to the weaponization of our community's trauma and fear and moral panic, these are 3 potent speed bumps on the path toward anti-Semitism alarm ringing. 3 forces that sometimes bias us toward shyness from saying hard and truthful things out loud. This is something that I have worked hard to confront in my own thinking and my own relationships over the past several decades. I have come to learn that to walk with integrity through this time demands that we sometimes sound the alarm, while being careful to do so without becoming alarmist, without unwittingly supporting a dangerous backlash that does more harm to us and to our democracy than saying nothing at all. The day after I delivered that very difficult sermon, wrestling as I have been with all of these ideas, trying to remain curious and compassionate, even while speaking honestly and openly about what I see as a dangerous illiberal trend in so-called liberal spaces, the very next day, I saw a mirror image vitriol and moral rot manifesting right here in Los Angeles. On Sunday morning, a slew of colleagues and friends who were at UCLA called to share their concerns that they were witnessing a conflagration erupting on campus. You've all seen the news by now. Leadership of our established Jewish community had put out the call, and thousands of LA Jews had responded. Come to campus to stand in solidarity with our Jewish students. Many from across the city went with love to stand in support of those students. This is a righteous instinct. But unfortunately, it was an ill-conceived setup. The soundstage was built just on the perimeter of the Palestinian Solidarity encampment. The Israeli music was blaring. I was horrified to hear that a giant screen was playing on repeat the video of Hamas atrocities, a true desecration of the dead, and an aggressive re-traumatization of anybody who walked by. By the time I arrived, after the formal program ended, there were thousands of protesters and counter-protesters gathered in such close proximity to one another that it could not help but turn into a street brawl. Yes, the aggression came from both sides. Before I arrived, 2 counter-protesters had already been hospitalized. As I approached the gathering, a group of protesters walked by me and shouted, "Come out, Jew, and fight me like a man." And some protesters held up enlarged pictures of Jeffrey Epstein. But my heart was broken on Sunday, not by these events, but by the language and the vitriol that came from our own Jewish community. At the invitation of the established Jewish community in an event funded by Jewish philanthropic dollars, a mob of hardline counter-protesters came to campus ready for a fight. People draped in Israeli flags screamed racist invective and accusations towards students in keffiyehs, language that I have to say matched some of the worst language that we've heard used against Jews in the last several months. A group Some of them wearing Stop Anti-Semitism t-shirts chanted, "You are all Hamas," as if racism only works in one direction, as if the narrow-minded, hateful rhetoric that so many Jewish students have been subjected to over the past 7 months will be healed by our own narrow-minded, hateful rhetoric toward those who stand now in solidarity with Palestinians. There were threats of violence. There was actual violence. I saw broken-hearted counter-protesters raging at broken-hearted protesters. It felt like everyone was drowning in opposite ends of a raging sea, a sea of grief and fury. I found my way to the small cluster of people withstanding together, Omdim Biyachad, Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Muslims, dedicated to building a more just and shared future. Among them was a Jewish UCLA student. A woman draped in an Israeli flag had just spit at her and said, "You should have been in Kfar Aza on October 7th. I wish I could say that that voice was singular in that space. It was certainly among the more extreme, but it was not unique. There was the undeniable outcome before us of months or years of mushrooming moral panic, precisely what we are so concerned about fueling. I heard from counter-protesters the same kind of hardened, maximalist language that has caused so much pain to our Jewish students, as if harming others can ever be a pathway toward our own healing. Just as a movement that normalizes virulent anti-Semitism is not a movement that will ever lead to justice for Palestinians, a movement that flattens and degrades Palestinians and their supporters will never lead to a safe and peaceful future for Jews. You cannot make a claim for the humanity of one people while simultaneously dehumanizing the other. We are all either created in God's image or none of us is. I don't know how many of the people who were there that day were among the group that returned to campus 2 days later for the now infamous night that Professor David Myers described as one of the darkest and most terrifying in UCLA's 105-year history. I was not there that night, but like many of you, I watched it unfold on my screen. Hundreds of counter-protesters throwing firecrackers and other heavy objects at the encampment, tearing down the walls, using chemical sprays, punching and beating students. All of this was done while blasting Israeli music. It took 3 hours for the police and security to stop the violence. It was ghastly. Just a few days before, right here on Shabbat, I had warned against justifying evidence of anti-Semitism as a few isolated incidents. I call that gaslighting. I argued that the whole movement shouldn't be dismissed because of the behavior of its worst actors, but anyone who cared about Palestinian justice needed to acknowledge the problem and needed to do everything possible to address it, to speak and to act with clear-headed urgency before violent language led to violent action. It is abundantly clear to me now that the same is demanded of our Jewish community. We must do better. We must be concerned not only for our safety, but for our soul. This is precisely what the student leadership of Hillel at UCLA is modeling. In a public letter this week, they wrote the following: "The truth is that a largely peaceful pro-Palestine encampment was attacked by an angry, violent mob comprised of fringe members of the off-campus Jewish community last night. They do not represent the estimated 3,000 Jewish Bruins at UCLA, and yet those are precisely the people who will have to live with the river rations of their aggressive actions. We cannot have a clearer ask of the off-campus Jewish community. Stay off our campus. Do not fund actions on campus. Do not protest on campus. Your actions are harming Jewish students," they wrote. "It is our responsibility to recognize how members of the Jewish community escalated the events of last night, and we have to take accountability and change course." End quote. As Rabbi Hanina taught, "Harbe lamadati merabotai, umitalmidai yoter mikulan." I have learned a lot from my teachers, but from my students, I have learned even more. The grown-ups would do well to hear the voices of the students here. I know there are many more similar actions planned in the days ahead. They are described as actions to support the memory of those we lost in the Holocaust. And so we will mark Yom HaShoah by showing up at campuses around the country. Please, if you will not hear me, hear the voices of our students. Stay off the campuses. Do not fund actions on these campuses. Do not protest on these campuses. These actions are harming our students. Now, all of this unfolded just as we concluded the holiday of Passover, the celebration of our liberation from the narrowest places of enslavement and subjugation. So I hope that you'll permit me one last take from the Exodus story before we return next week to the wonders of Leviticus. My colleague and friend, Rabbi Steph Colin, gave a beautiful sermon last week about the Erev Rav, about the mixed multitude that joined the Israelites as they left enslavement in Mitzrayim, in Egypt. She points out that in Mitzrayim, everything was black and white, good and evil. You are Moses or you are Pharaoh, us or them. But then she says, something extraordinary and radical and new happened. On the day we went forth from Mitzrayim, when we slipped our shackles and ran to the edge of the sea, the narrative changed. V'gam erev rav ala itam, a mixed multitude went up with them. We left Mitzrayim, not just us, but a mixed multitude of people with us. Ibn Ezra teaches that this erev rav included Egyptians too. Egyptians who joined their caravan to ours. All who sought freedom set a trajectory towards shared liberation. It wasn't viable any longer to think in terms of good and evil, us and then. If we were going to navigate the raw nature of an unfriendly wilderness, we were all going to have to make it out. Oppression is zero-sum. Freedom is expansive. Rabbi Colin goes on to write that in a Mitzrayim mentality, the framework for oppression, only one people survives whole, gets freedom, gets safety, gets dignity, gets favor. But our exodus, our liberation story is an Erev Rav mentality. It's not an either or, but a both and all in. Safety, possibility, freedom, hope for everyone on the journey. I love this teaching. I love that the journey toward liberation is not exclusive to one person or another, but rather a collective journey once you decide to cast your lot with those in its pursuit. And I add to this idea that not only did Egyptians join Israelites on their way to freedom, but also many Israelites chose to stay behind in Egypt when the time for the redemption had come. In fact, we learn from Rashi that fully only one-fifth of the Israelites chose to leave. Fully 80% of them stayed behind. 80% of the Israelites stayed behind in Egypt. The Midrash suggests that these were people among the Israelites who had accumulated wealth and honor, which are among the trappings that disincline us from unsticking ourselves, from leaving Mitzrayim to journey toward the world that could be. This makes me think of Dr. Yasmin Abu Fraiha, a Bedouin doctor at Soroka Hospital in Israel South, one of the first doctors to receive and treat victims of the atrocities on October 7th. Just days later, in the midst of the terrible trauma and upheaval of that time, she said the following: the real dividing line is not between Israelis and Palestinians, but between those who believe that violence is the answer and those who believe that there is another way. The hardline rhetoric of our times does not leave a lot of space for voices like this. But as the situation devolves, not only there, but also here, I hear Yasmin's whisper as a moral cry in the night. She is calling us to another way, a mixed multitude of people who care deeply about the future, who offer a full-throated rejection of the violent, extremist, reductive idea that Palestinians and Jews must be eternal enemies, that one's victory necessitates another's victimhood, or even worse, elimination. She rejects the idea that we undermine our own sorrow or betray our own people when we expand the scope of our moral concern to see one another. At one point on Sunday, standing between protesters and counter-protesters, one of the Standing Together Los Angeles leaders, an Israeli named Mikey, took the bullhorn and started to chant, "In Gaza, in Tel Aviv, all children deserve to live. In Gaza, in Tel Aviv, all children deserve to live." It was a profound moment. The most basic call. Our children, our precious children, deserve life. And I stood there and wondered, can a tempered message like this be heard amidst all of this heat, amidst the shouting and the shoving? But within moments, I noticed that protesters and counter-protesters alike took up the call. They started to clap. They joined the chant. Only moments before, these people were shouting at each other, as I said, across the raging sea. It seemed that those protesters, each of whom is driven by their own grief and their righteous desire for justice, did not know that such a collective call was even imaginable. But then Mikey handed them a life raft, big enough to hold us all. How could they not join that call? Could any reasonable person argue against the children of Gaza and Tel Aviv deserving to live? Ahmed Fuad al-Khatib, a Palestinian whom I met this week, visited the encampment at UCLA just before it was dismantled. Here is a small part of his assessment of what he saw. Most students, he wrote, are sincere and absolutely have their hearts in the right place. They are, however, misguided, and they are being led by extreme, radical, and genuinely detrimental organizations, voices, and revolutionary types who are the worst possible allies and spokespeople for the Palestinian people. If presented with the right balance of information, analysis, assessment, and recommendations, I am confident that many, if not most, students will likely adjust course and become better informed protesters and advocates. Ahmed Fuad al-Khatib is from Gaza. He has already lost 31 family members and friends in the last 7 months. This is his voice. And I believe that the same can be true about many of the Jewish protesters who showed up ostensibly in solidarity at the protests this past week. Many of them are sincere and absolutely have their hearts in the right place, but they are misguided. They are being led by extreme, radical, and genuinely detrimental intentions and voices and revolutionary types who are the worst possible allies and spokespeople for the Jewish people. But if they are presented with the right balance of information, analysis, assessment, and recommendation, I too am confident that many of them will adjust course and become better advocates for their own cause. From the righteous grief and rage at the suffering in Gaza and the brokenhearted devastation of Tel Aviv and Haifa and Yaffo and Yerushalayim, we can reject extremism and hatred. We can leave it back in Mitzrayim, back in that narrow place. And instead, we can join forces with Yasmin and Ahmed and Mikey and the people of Standing Together and so many others. A new Erev Rav, a new mixed multitude of Jews and Muslims, Palestinians and Israelis who are investing in a new landscape of possibility, helping to awaken a new social imagination, a new moral imagination. There's room for everyone on that life raft. Grabbing onto it is a choice that every one of us can make, and I hope we will. Shabbat Shalom.